Our action-packed evening continues. Thank you for your endurance and your interest. We've got a great panel lined up. This second panel, I'm Mark Andreevich. I think everybody probably knows by now. I'll just go through the intro to this panel and then turn it over to Dan Angus, who will be moderating. So this is Dan. I'm going to skip him and go straight to Simon. Simon Elvery is an award-winning Brisbane-based journalist and developer at ABC News Story Lab. He's currently a journalist fellow at Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, the University of Oxford, where he's researching the use of technology by journalists in the reporting process. His work covers a wide range of topics, including data visualization, climate change, data security and privacy, and algorithmic accountability, which fits, of course, with the interests of the hackathon. Sam Kinnamonth, next to Simon, is Policy Officer for the Australian Communications Consumer Action Network. Sam is a communications researcher and consumer policy advocate. He's a policy officer at ACAN, which is Australia's peak body representing all consumers on communication issues, including telecommunications, broadband, and emerging new services. Sam contributes to ACAN's efforts to provide a consumer voice on digital platforms and emerging services. Sam's doctoral thesis, titled The Programmatic Promise, focuses on automated media markets and communications infrastructures through a study of programmatic advertising and ad tech. Sam has published work in journals including Television and New Media and presented research in Australia and internationally. And I should mention that ACAN provided funding for the very early version of the Ad Observatory project. So we're grateful to ACAN for getting that started. That was several years ago now, but the project continues, and we're delighted to have had that initial support. Next to Sam is, you're not all in order, is Verity Trott, who's lecturer in digital media research at Monash University. Dr. Verity Trott is lecturer in digital media research. Her published research explores digital feminist activism, popular anti-feminism, online communities and platform politics, and digital masculinities. She's a member of the Automated Society Working Group at Monash University, in which she investigates the impacts of digital technology and automation from feminist and intersectional standpoints, and she's an affiliate investigator with the ARC Center for Automated Decision Making in Society. And next to Verity is Jane Tan, who is a software engineer in the Digital Media Research Center at QUT. Jane obtained her Bachelor of Information Technology and Master of Computer Science degrees from the University of Queensland in 2018 and 2019, respectively. In her studies, she participated in high-performance parallel computing research, building a compiler to translate from OpenACC to OpenMP. This is beyond my skill level, and completed an internship with the National University of Singapore Digital Media Research Lab, working on surface meshing algorithms with GPU using CUDA thrust. CUDA, okay. In her role with the Digital Media Research Center at QUT, she focuses on the utility of computational methods, including techniques such as topic modeling, machine learning, and information visualization to explore everyday promotional cultures in visual social media platforms. She's played a key role in helping to develop the image classifier that we used in processing some of the ads that we got from the Ad Observatory project and earlier iterations of that project. Next to Jane is Lizzie O'Shea, who is the chair of Digital Rights Watch. Lizzie is a human rights lawyer specializing in public interest litigation. Lizzie has local and international experience in a wide array of court jurisdictions and is passionate about equality before the law and that the rule of law should be protected, particularly given the incursions on civil liberties that have become a staple part of the war on terror. In 2019, Lizzie received the Human Rights Hero Award for her work campaigning against Australia's encryption laws. And moderating the panel tonight will be Professor Daniel Angus, who's a professor in the School of Communications and leader of the Computational Communications and Culture program in QUT's Digital Media Research Center. His research focuses on the development and application of visual computational analysis methods in communication and media studies, with a specific focus on conversation and social media data. His novel computational methods have improved our understanding of the nature of communication in medical consultations, conversations in aged care settings, television broadcasts, social media, and newspaper reporting. Dan has been involved in computer science research for 20 years, and he contributes regularly to media and industry on the impact of technology on society. And Dan is also an associated investigator with the ARC Center for Automated Decision Making in Society. Dan, thanks so much. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you everyone on the panel for giving us your time tonight to come and share your insights and kind of experiences within this very broad topic of dark ads. So we've just had a fantastic panel, and thank you so much to the panelists and Nick for kicking us off tonight. There's been some really interesting conversations, kind of, I guess, laying out the land in front of us, right? And really kind of helping us contextualize the scope of the challenge in front of us, and really thinking about, and I guess getting us thinking around just the mountain we have to climb, I think, ahead of us. So what we'd hoped with this second panel then is to start to climb that mountain, right? Is to think about, and particularly from all of your perspectives, how do we begin to start to push back? How do we begin to build the necessary tooling to bring that kind of accountability? How do we start to tackle this issue? And so where I'd love to kick us off in this second panel then is on maybe some provocations for those in the audience that are part of the hackathon, but broadly as well, some of the directions that you think we could be considering in trying to tackle this problem. And now, reflecting on the amazing breadth of diversity we have on the panel, these are obviously going to be, perhaps, Lizzie, from your perspective, more legal policy, perspectives. Jane and yours might be more technically minded. Verity and Sam, from your perspectives, like other kinds of critical interventions and maybe policy and regulatory interventions. And of course, Simon, what are some of the kind of journalistic or media-oriented lenses that we can start to look at this through? So maybe that's where we kick it off. And Lizzie, if you don't mind, if I start with you at the end, is some of those thoughts you had around where can we go here? Like, what do we need to do to start to kind of tackle the mammoth task of bringing greater transparency, accountability back into the ad space?
Yeah, so if I've got just a couple of minutes here to make a couple of points to kick us off, and then I'm looking forward to the dialogue between us, because I think this kind of cross-disciplinary dialogue is how we make advances in this space. To be honest, I don't think lawyers alone, believe it or not, can solve the world's problems. But I had to squeeze a lawyer and joke in there as the lawyer. But what I would say is, I suppose there's three things I'd want to say. The first is that there are currently laws that exist that we know companies like Meta and Google have breached. And the most obvious example is things like discrimination law. We know that Facebook is engaged in digital redlining to exclude certain people from seeing certain kinds of ads based on race. We know that Google is an automated ad category which included Nazi sympathisers, for example. Automatically generated, but still there's a question there around whether that's in breach of discrimination law. So one of the things I would say is there's pre-existing laws that can deal with some of the harms that are caused by advertising in digital spaces. However, there is a problem with enforcement. And so to some degree, it's very difficult as a lawyer to know where these harms are occurring, and we rely on, people who are doing hackathons, we rely on journalists, we rely on whistleblowers to tell us about these instances of wrongdoing, because as an everyday consumer, as I'm sure you're aware, it's a very atomizing experience being online, and you can't necessarily have a line of sight on how the company is operating. So there are some laws that exist, is the first thing I suppose I'd say, and it's worth thinking about that as we look, as you guys look at some of this data. I don't think it's enough to expect the regulator to be able to tackle these problems alone. I think it is very important that individuals have the right to be able to complain about this kind of conduct and have the option of pursuing it in court. I'm a bit of a hammer and everything looks like a nail, but I like litigating, but I think it does actually play a really important role in holding companies to account. Even if it's at an individual scale, it can have long-standing, broader implications, and we need to look for ways to enable people to do that, and that will involve work with lawyers and others. Having said that, of course, there's still plenty of room for improvement in terms of how we regulate online spaces to ameliorate some of the harms caused by particularly advertising, but generally the data economy, the secondary data market in particular. And there's various concepts and methods for thinking about this, things like purpose limitation on the collection of information, creating fiduciary obligations, so obligations to act in the best interests of somebody if you're collecting their personal information, and things like data minimization, concepts like that might limit the capacity for companies to collect this information. And among other things, I suppose, I would say, as a human rights person, that we do need a Charter of Rights. In Australia, Australia is the only liberal democracy without a Charter of Rights, and that has an impact on the rest of the laws that we have and people's a sense of citizenship and the capacity to have these discussions in public spaces about what the role is of corporations over our lives. And so, it seems silly to not talk about the Optus data hack actually in this context, because I think it's instructive for a few different reasons. Firstly, it sets out clearly that our policy environment requires, and in fact requires but also does allow huge amounts of information to be collected about us and held by corporate entities. And this is not just dangerous for us individually, especially if you're now a victim of this hack, you may be facing the consequences in terms of identity theft. It's actually also really damaging to our democracy, and this is where I think you guys come in, and this question around dark advertising is particularly pertinent, because it does create online environments that are hostile to constructive public debate, because there's a clear financial motivation against that. So I think one of the things that comes out of this is we do need strong penalties in this space. It's not enough to just frame wrongdoing around harm caused, but because harm can be quite clearly amorphous, it can be very, very much delayed, it can be hard to articulate, it can be collective rather than individual. And in that context, we absolutely need penalties for misuse of personal information and for conduct that is otherwise quite difficult to detect, that is in breach of various laws, whether they're discrimination or also privacy laws. And this is my last point that I wanted to make, that privacy is actually the critical space that I think we need to focus on. I mean, part of that is because I see that as stopping the source for the online ad market and the secondary data market. If we can stop the information from being taken from people, then we stop all the negative externalities that arise as a result of the secondary data market, but also even internal to some of these enormous platforms like Facebook and Google. The other thing I'd say about privacy reform is we're actually in an environment where this is actively being discussed. So it's a reform that we can demand and discuss because we are going through a review of the Privacy Act for the first time in a long time. So here's a clear opportunity to start talking to our lawmakers about what we think privacy reform should look like. And I'm very much an advocate for giving people more control over their information as individuals, to be able to be seen and treated with dignity, not just as, other people on the panel I'm sure will have different things to say about this, but not just as consumers. We're not just trying to make the ad market work better. We're actually trying to treat people with respect, give them autonomy and the right to determine their own destiny. And that's what human rights law really is about, creating the circumstances for that to occur. And I think privacy is often perceived as being very narrow about information management, when I think it is about freedom and autonomy, and that's how we should think about this. And the secondary data market and dark advertising is a key influence working against people's autonomy and rights. So I think it's critically important work that we figure out how to create space for people to make use of the incredible creation that is networked computing without being subservient to the profit motive of advertising companies and the associated externalities with that marketplace, which limit people's dignity and autonomy. And yeah, that's hopefully what you guys will be doing tonight and what we're talking about tonight, but that's my perspective, that people are rights holders and they are entitled to participate in public life online with dignity and respect.
Great opening points, Lizzie, and I completely agree. I think it's a frustration we find is that often the reaction to some of these harms is, well, just don't go on the platform or just don't do this, rather than one which is empowering and says, well, no, you have a right to be there, you have a right to be safe, you have a right for your details not to be harvested and used in kind of predatory ways against you. So they're great opening provocations. Thank you so much. And we'll come back to this idea, I think, also of that you raised around enforcement and things like charters of rights and such as well as we go on. But Jane, maybe you want to offer a few thoughts, and noting Mark kind of open talking about some of the work that we did together on the early kind of ACAN work, and you're obviously there collecting and helping us gather a lot of this data, but also analyze all of that data. What are some of your thoughts, and perhaps the hackathon participants as well, around the difficulties you've faced in perhaps collecting this and things you'd like to see done better?
Thanks, Anne. Like, I think on top of like with my technical knowledge in these machine learning tools, I think on top of building machine vision tools, I find myself like a lot of time that the first component of what I have to do is data collection from all these like social media platforms, and the majority of it is through Meta, like the Facebook and Instagram. So like there's been a bit of an upheaval like throughout the process, and that's an understatement. So like the Facebook has this tool that's called like Facebook Ad Library, that if you go to your browser and look up this tool, like you can see that it provides public access to the advertisements that is currently running on Facebook, which means that ads that has expired, that's running for a short while and that has expired, will soon to be cease to exist from this library. So like that's issue number one. Like with the lack of access to ad archive, we often find ourselves like having this challenge of having to set up frequent ad collections so that we don't miss out any advertisements that's like short-lived. So like that's issue number one. Like, and also like with the previous issues with U.S. election, Facebook has this ad under the category of issues, elections, on politics. So like and it has a separate programming API that allows public researchers to collect data from this API. So like essentially what we do is that we send requests to this web URL, and then we get a list of advertisements that's essentially ties to the sort of a subset of that data set that Facebook has of all the advertisements that are running. And then so like, and also like apart from that, the metadata we get from this API is a lot more detailed than all the advertisements that you see on the web interface itself. One of the most important attributes that you get from the metadata is the demographic information about the targeted audience. So like that's really useful. That's a really useful information for just public research, public interest research, to just hold these platforms accountable for what they're doing. So like that's issue number two, because of like the lack of support to the detailed information of what we get from these platforms. Like it is really challenging for us to collect enough data to support what we're doing, like for all these research in general. Yeah.
Data access, I mean, number one, right? And it came up on the first panel, and it continues to be a problem, right? And I guess one of the frustrations that we've faced when we're trying to work through this is this idea that for the political category you talked about, Jane, it's almost like Meta flicked a switch and said, all right, well, you can have access through a well-maintained API. You can get all of this metadata around the targeting information, which is de-anonymized, which is, in its very, very clean, machine-readable form, and has all the checks and balances you would want. And that exists for this tiny, tiny sliver category of politics issues and elections category. But for all the other ads, we could technically do the same thing, but we actively choose not to, right? And I think it's important when we have discussions around this, is that does feel like an active choice, right? This is not done by accident, right? There has been a decision made that they will restrict it as far as they can until such point that there's equal public outrage, there's provocation from the first panel of find me a scandal, right? That are we going to have to find a scandal for every single kind of advertising subcategory in order to get the access through all the metadata, right? I mean, maybe, but yeah, I share your frustration, Jane. And I think there's many in the audience that share it as well. Verity, do you want to kick us off with some thoughts around, things that we could think about and ways we can start to push back?
Yeah, I guess there's a couple of things. Just stemming off that scandal prompt, and also something that Erin mentioned about scams, is when we first collected the pilot data back in 2019 ahead of the Australian federal election back then, we were browsing through some of the samples that we'd collected, and there were some really weird patterns of fake ads, which were kind of fake news, but also some really weird like screenshots of broadcast media, like a Channel 9 screenshot of the Channel 9 news. And there were two types of fake ads, I guess, that we were seeing. One was the classic misinformation, where it was a mock-up of a news article, and if you followed the links, it would take you to this kind of ghost Facebook page, and it would have some random name like Autumn Leaf or Wolf of the Dark. You know, it was like so nondescript and weird. And then if you follow the links further, it would actually take you to a website that was a fake mainstream newspaper website. So we saw ones of like the New York Times, I think it was the Guardian, and the Sydney Morning Herald, and it was so clearly fake. Like none of the links worked on the website. It was just the front page, and it was filled with all these nonsensical articles. And at the time we were like, what does this actually mean? Because none of it was actively political. So there was no real agenda behind it. It was just kind of nonsense. So we thought maybe it was being used to just disrupt the feed of certain people who might be targeted from political ads, or it might be trial runs of some misinformation ecosystem, preliminary trial runs, I guess. But we didn't really find a conclusion about that. That's really speculative. But the second type of fake ads that we saw, and this ties into what Erin was saying in the previous panel, were those screenshots of like David Kochie or Andrew Forrest. And I think there was also one of like Kylie Minogue, and then under it was a cryptocurrency scam. And they want people to go and sign up and all of that. This year I saw, so that was like 2019, and we didn't really do anything with it, and people weren't that interested about it, and then COVID happened. But I saw that there were some global like UK celebrities that were raging about their faces being used in these scam ads. And then this year in March, the ACCC brought a federal court case against Meta for these scam ads. And I don't think it's been resolved yet. I think there's been some legal hold-up in the last update, I think was August. And it was maybe you could, maybe you know about it, Lizzie. I don't know the legal dispute here about where it's categorized. But it will have implications, I guess, in terms of who is actually responsible for the content. And it just reminds me of the current conversations or debates that Australia has around who is responsible in terms of the news media content and hosting of comments. So that will have a massive implication, I guess, in terms of whether Facebook's responsible for scam ads. What does that mean for other types of ads that we're seeing? What does that mean for prices changing in adverts or any other kind of scandal that might pop up? So I guess that's my provocation in terms of let's see what happens this year.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Verity, because I mean, Australia does feel like sometimes we're this really odd little ecosystem where a lot of crazy stuff happens, right? You know, the Voller case that you referenced there was a quite famous case where, yeah, as you say, the owners of these Facebook pages were held liable for the comments that were left there, and it's massive implications for a lot of people and how they manage their social media accounts and presence in Australia. Obviously, Facebook News ban is another case. Like, we seem to be this place where all the weird stuff happens, right, on our social media. So I don't know, maybe we make a breakthrough, right, in the ads accountability space. Sam, what thoughts have you got for us to kind of kick off around big ideas, things you'd love to see, and otherwise?
Relating to dark ads?
Yeah.
So yeah, thanks for having me, everyone. It's a really hard act to follow. Kate and Erin, what they said is mirrors so much of what we're thinking. So a bit of context is ACAN, the Australian Communications Consumer Action Network, was formed in 2008 to represent consumers with phones and the internet. As we've progressed with how we communicate, ACAN has increasingly found ourselves representing consumers on the internet and digital platform space. As many of you would be aware, the digital platforms are how we communicate for the most part. When we send a text message, when we make a phone call, those are increasingly blurred boundaries with what we mean by that kind of denominator, right? Like a text might be Facebook Messenger, it might be WhatsApp, it might be other different ways of communicating. And many of these ways that we could almost think of as a platform layer on top of this telecommunications infrastructure are supported by advertising. So It's an interesting one, right? Because I'm kind of wearing two hats here as a PhD candidate researching programmatic advertising for a while, and as a policy consumer advocate. The way ACAN would think about it, I think, more is as a consumer experience. There's obviously the stuff that Erin and Kate were talking about with discriminatory pricing. So with the selling of internet and phone goods, and there has been a historical lots of shady dealing. Erin was actually at ACAN for a while, so she'd be able to regale us, I think, with many great stories. But I think that ACAN also would be really interested in this kind of broader understanding of, as we shift from, I'm pretty sure it's Plantin et al. That refer to like a platformatization of infrastructure and an infrastructuralization of platforms. So that is to say, shifting from one way of dealing with things to another. Where we can think about this in the policy space is when we're thinking about like the regulation of advertising, say, a lot of the advertising regulation, as many of you would know, would happen through the Broadcasting Services Act and through kind of these big infrastructural turns, this idea that you have this shared infrastructure that runs through the nation, and we all kind of take part and we all regulate together. And then, of course, from the 90s, and you get the kind of the Clintonian kind of free market internet way of doing things. And that leads to, of course, platformatization platforms, which are far more individualized and atomized, as Lizzie was saying. So I guess what I'd be particularly interested in is thinking about what does it mean when the communications infrastructure is funded by advertising, what kind of affordances or biases, perhaps you could say, does that bring in?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, it's interesting even how the platforms themselves have positioned on either side of that, right? As like, when it suits, we're just the poles and wires, right? We're not kind of responsible for anything else. And then when it suits, it's like, no, we're news and that. And so we're afforded all the kinds of same protections that involves, and play this kind of dance between both. And you wonder whether the gig is up a little bit on that, or kind of seeing the end of that, particularly in light of some of the things that I was just mentioning in certain kind of case law and others, that kind of framing is kind of reached at the end of its lifetime.
And if you look at, sorry to interject here, but if you look at like a lot of the history of advertising regulation, particularly, I was thinking about the health stuff from the previous panel, but some of the first advertising regulation in Australia was around patent medicine and what's called quackery. There's a great advertising historian here at RMIT called Robert Crawford, who basically looked at how the industry, almost out of embarrassment about this patent medicine, kind of had to intervene to an extent. So I guess one interesting thing I'd also like to mention is thinking, like we're talking a lot about consumers and platforms, but there is also another kind of side to this multi-sided market, which is the clients, the advertisers.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the agencies.
I will get to that actually, Sam, because it's interesting. What hasn't been talked about yet are actually the advertisers themselves, right, and their role in all of this. And there's some recent cases, perhaps, of one I know of advertisers, particularly small and medium-sized business, who've had ads blocked on platforms, right, with no kind of positive kind of response from the platforms that were banning the ads. No real rationale clearly behind it. The ads were perfectly legitimate as far as everyone could see, and so even that it's perhaps, we don't want to say, not all advertisers, right? But, it's that idea that, well, actually, yeah, advertising still is legitimate, right, in many ways. And so some of these protections also need to fall on the other side, right? That, the platforms perhaps in the middle are playing both sides off against each other a little bit. But yeah, before we get too far into that, Simon, I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about your perspective from, someone who's a journalist and the ways in which you've been covering this perhaps as an issue and any thoughts you have.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dan. I guess this panel is really interesting to me because it's such a broad mix of different disciplines, and I'm really interested to get into the conversation as well. But yeah, we'll definitely I do have a few opening thoughts. And the first thing I thought it worth talking about is just thinking over the last 5 years or so, I think there has been quite a shift in the general public awareness of data and privacy, and the complications and the trouble that can involve. people I think are definitely becoming more alarmed, maybe even, thank you Optus, about the kind of privacy threats that exist in digital spaces. But we're here to talk about advertising markets, and I do wonder whether that same kind of awareness or alarm or concern extends to advertising in the same way it does to things like big data breaches or leaks from large companies or government organisations. And I don't think it does. I don't think people care about that as much. So despite generally becoming more aware of privacy issues, I think for many, especially through that lens of targeted advertising, they really don't think it affects them very much, and so they just don't care. Some people, and I am repeatedly reminded about this whenever I talk about it in public, even think targeted advertising is great. They actually like it. The common refrain is sort of, well, if it means I get a good deal or I find out about some product that I like and I wouldn't have known about otherwise, then isn't that good for me? And to that, my response would be essentially, let's think about some of the discussion on the last panel. How confident are you that you're getting a good deal? Discriminatory pricing is definitely a thing, but we don't know to what extent because of the lack of transparency around this stuff. If people don't care about it, from a journalistic storytelling point of view, telling stories about targeted advertising and data privacy is like a bit of a heavy lift sometimes. It's a pretty dry topic to start with, so we need all the strategies we can get to be engaging in this space. You asked for provocations earlier, Dan. One that I might put out there is maybe we could think about whether we can leverage self-interest to generate some interest in this space, and try and think about the ways we can tell the stories of dark ads that affects people individually, and kind of makes it clear to them that it's not just the other people who might run up against some discriminatory practices. One of the people involved in the forerunner of this project at NYU and ProPublica was Jeremy Merrill, and I'm quite fond of a quote from him that I heard him say once. He said that something like, he loves working with academics because case studies are the bycatch of the academic process and they make great stories. And to echo earlier suggestions, find us a scandal. Like, that's the kind of thing that he's talking about there. Like, if the case studies that can be exposed through the academic research process can be scandalous, and they can be really interesting stories. But then, because they've been exposed through this academic process, when you pair that with the kind of a stronger, more generalisable conclusions that research hopes to be able to put forward, that's something really worth writing about as a journalist. So, yeah, definitely interested in that. Another issue that I think it's really worth just bringing up to talk about and to think about as you're working through your ideas on this space, the data economy and privacy and digital ads, is that media organisations are hopelessly compromised in this space. And we collect an awful lot of data about our audience, and the worst, or at least the most prolific offenders, I think it's fair to say, are commercial media, but even public media organisations like the ABC are definitely not very good at this stuff. And the perverse thing about it is that often we're not even doing it deliberately. It's not even for a purpose. It's just like incidental from some other activity we do as part of our work, like embedding a social media post in a story that you're reading. That's a data collection process for those social media organisations. And so, I'd go as far as to say that most media organisations don't even know all the data they're collecting, where it's going, who they're collecting it on behalf of, or even who benefits most from that data collection. So that's something that I think as an industry, as a media industry, we really need to think about, but also, it'd be good to think about that in the context of the hackathon, I think. There's a media organisation in the US called the Markup. If you're not familiar with it, please Google it after this. They do some really great stories in this space. But one of the things I found really interesting about them is that they went to huge lengths to minimise the data that they were collecting about their audience. And if you go back and read some of Julia Angwin's early posts that she wrote around the time she was setting up the company, it really illustrates how difficult it is actually to not collect data. Even when you're trying not to, it's kind of a hard thing to do. So that kind of speaks to the whole ecosystem, and like the system that has been set up just makes it difficult sometimes to do the right thing even when you're trying to. A final thought is that I think we really need, as reporters, as journalists, I think we really need to be careful about who we're reporting for, or we need to think about it carefully. Digital privacy, who has access to it and who benefits from it, is a reflection of existing power structures and different existing privileges. And understanding and reporting on how these issues affect the least powerful among us is really important. But it's also really important that we're able to tell stories with broad appeal and speak to a large audience. And so that's a real challenge from a journalistic point of view, I think.
Is it? I mean, Simon, fantastic points, of course. The tightrope that we walk then between, a lot of the work focused on the most vulnerable, right? Do you think that then that's playing against, and I'll open this up to anyone else on the panel who wants to comment on it, of course, that by focusing on those particular communities, that we start to other, right? And we start to look at, well, I'm not, and this has already kind of come up a little bit today. We heard a comment on this around the idea of, well, I don't click on ads, or I'm not affected by this, right? And I challenge that, right? Like we are all affected to some degree by this ecosystem. We are all impacted by it in some way. But this approach, well, I'm different. Like I'm somehow different. Do you think there's a danger there when all of our stories are on those who are?
Yeah, totally. And we are all affected, but demonstrating that in a compelling story format is actually pretty difficult, as I was sort of saying, like it's a fairly dry topic. And one of the things that has the potential to make it less dry and make it a story of real interest is finding harms that we can talk about. Often, because it disproportionately affects people with less power, the harms are easier to find in those kind of demographics, I suppose. But it's worth saying that the harms, specific case studies of harms are actually incredibly difficult to find generally. And I think, Liz, you were saying that earlier from a legal perspective as well. They're just difficult to find. And often I think, even if you can find them, they're not always something you should write about. You should do a story about. There's a real risk of re-victimization around reporting on some of this stuff. So yeah, definitely very good food for thought about where the focus is.
Yeah, I mean, Verity, I might throw you, because I know some of this came up in the work we did with the ACAN project, right? That we're finding that would absolutely define gender stereotyping at work in that, and whether you've got any thoughts around that and what Simon's been talking about here.
Yeah, so a really interesting part about, I think, the data set and the tool that you guys get to work with is the fact that it shows us data from the why have I seen this aspect of, the Facebook, I guess, affordance. And one of the things that we found early on initially was that, and what I'm really interested into is the social and cultural messaging that is conveyed through ads, but also through the targeted system, because that's where, the unique layer comes into play here. And initially we were like, wow, advertisers are not very creative, because so many of the ads were like, oh, you're a woman, here you go, all the fashion. You just get fashion and makeup, stationery. And then the men get cars, gambling, alcohol, not cocktails, whoever said that before on the last panel, that's for women. It was really binary in terms of the stereotypes that they were promoting. But what we found also interesting, and I think there's some other research on this too, is that Facebook allows you to create your own profile, right? And you can put your own gender, identity, and your own interests there. And they're actually, and they got a lot of kudos for this, that they allowed people to pick from out of over 100 gender identity labels, or you could create your own too, But through the algorithmic system, at least on the advertising side, that all doesn't exist. You're a man or you're a woman. And that is continually reinforced through the ads. So that does create harm for people who might not want to be seen or be categorized that way constantly whenever they log onto their phone. They don't want to just see pink fashion because they're a woman, or because Facebook says they're a woman, even if they've put that they're transmasculine on their Facebook page. So they just can't break beyond those binaries through that system. So I really do, one of the key prompts, I think, is for people to check out that, why have I seen this? And also, and I'm not sure, I can't remember how much the tool actually shows us. You might remember, Jane. But Facebook will say you've seen this ad for 2 or 3 reasons, like you're a woman, you're in this location, you're in this age, or you're interested in fashion. But there's actually a whole host of other reasons why you might have seen that they're not being transparent about. So it's kind of just a flag, right? Like political or, bit of a hope here, this is why you probably saw this, but it doesn't tell you the whole picture either. And so I'm really interested in digging deeper to find out actually where are some of those connections and overlaps that you might be able to find through what people are saying. And I really do think, and I know it's not part of the hackathon, but the interviews there are really, really useful to help contextualize why someone is seeing what they're seeing. There was one case study that we had, and she was seeing a lot of ads about disability for kids. And then she very reluctantly said in the interview, oh yeah, my kid has autism. And she was seeing so many of those ads, and she was a bit put out that we could know that about her just through seeing her data, but it was quite unique to what she was seeing there. So yeah, definitely have a look at the why am I seeing this aspect of the tool.
Yeah, the waste tags are a really important part. I mean, sorry, Jane, do you want to respond to any of that?
Yeah, if I may just add to that, with that question that you brought about, why am I seeing this ad, especially through the ad collections, through the Facebook ad library, for one of the projects that I'm involved in, that we are collecting alcohol advertisements that's in collaboration with Fair, that unfortunately falls outside of the category of political ads. So we have to go out at great lengths to collect the advertisements, and those metadata is missing. From even if we manage to collect those ads, those demographic data is missing from the advertisements that we collected. That's problematic in a sense, because we just don't know the link between yes, we get the information about the advertisements that they are showing on Meta, but then we don't really know about the targeted audience of those advertisements.
Yeah, there's one in the political context even that we do a lot of work covering elections and politics in Australia, and we were covering the Queensland state election a couple of years back. And it was really interesting because we knew that there were targeted ads that the Australian Labor Party were placing pro-coal in the regions, so around Gladstone and those areas that are very much kind of, coal is their thing, and very much not running these ads in Brisbane, right? And if you followed the federal election, you'll know why that is the case, right? It bit them in the Fed election. And so what was really interesting there is we knew that was happening, but all Meta would provide is this ad was run in Queensland, right? The geotagging data was so general that it's basically absolutely useless, right? Any fool could tell you, yes, of course this ad was run in Queensland. Why would you spend money to run a Queensland state election ad outside of Queensland, right? Thank you very much, Meta. But that level of granularity is missing, right? So even the scant data we get often is missing that level of granularity, which is why we went after the Ad Observatory approach, which is get people to tell us where they are and then collect the ads that they see. But Lizzie, do you want to add anything onto this?
I was just going to, now you've given me the opportunity. I suppose what I'd say, from a reform perspective, you can think about why it is that Facebook gives access or makes the conscious choice that you're talking about. I mean, I think it's probably in part informed by the fact that they've been associated with essentially genocide in Myanmar because they allowed the military to essentially take over lots of social media, lots of sites within the social media platform to put forward anti-Rohingya propaganda, right? So I think that they have genuinely reflected on that and considered this to be the minimum accountability measure that they could take. And I think it is really interesting that they treat elections aren't treated the same around the world. Like, there's a huge amount of resources put into the United States election, probably other English-speaking democracies, less so if you're somewhere else. So, how do Facebook people think? Well, that's the minimum accountability that they're prepared to give. Could they be prepared to be pushed also on things like alcohol? But the other thing that comes to mind, I'm a board member of the Alliance for Gambling Reform, gambling, which, the gambling industry spends, hundreds of millions of dollars recruiting new people. And, Simon, you were talking about whether people are interested in online advertising and its phenomenon, its impact on society. Gambling, I think, is a perfect example where people are interested. They hate that children know the odds on the grand final rather than watching, the sport itself. I think lots of people around the country hate this stuff. And so if you are thinking as an advocate, how can I get the next win that might improve this experience of being online for people, that might minimise harm, that might also bring greater accountability to platforms, bring greater transparency to the public discussion around advertising dollars and how they're spent. Maybe you think through what kind of predatory industries might be able to be targeted next, and that's, I think we should be ambitious in that sense. I mean, that's actually a small, a small kind of project, but it is actually one that's winnable, I think, to start talking what else can we get them to do. Because if you can see terrible things going on in an election period, the chances are outside of it, there's obviously terrible things going on in industries that are predatory, that perhaps are less inclined to publicly advertise as well, or payday lenders being another obvious example. If they can do that in an atomised way and without any accountability, they will do that, right? So these are topics I think the public do want to talk about, and I would be reluctant to assume they don't, but it is a job for us to kind of identify the trends, and lawyers to work with, or advocates seeking reform to work with people who have access to this data, who are interested in these topics, have an understanding of some of these industries, as well as the capacity of Facebook, which is, and among others, but which is what hopefully you'll also come to terms with in this process, what they can provide and what they should therefore provide as well.
If just one thought on that, and I realise this is not the Gruen transfer, and I'm certainly not Will Anderson.
I do hate the Gruen transfer as a normalisation of advertising.
But yeah, it's on this point of the normalisation. Yeah, the normalisation of advertising. But on that point about gambling, right? Whether most of the gambling advertising that I see and certainly have analysed seems to try and use humour, right? And it's kind of normalised a certain kind of humorous take on it. Do you feel, or anyone else want to comment on that, and kind of getting into how do we start to understand almost the aesthetics of advertising, the forms of content that are out there, the messages and such, because there's this question of harm. Do you see that, Lizzie, as a harm kind of mitigation strategy by saying, it's less harmful because it's actually humorous, or it's, and that's how they kind of get around that negativity around it, by trying to make it more humorous?
Yeah, well, I think that's deeply insidious. I mean, it's also just seen as you're a wowser if you're against this, which I think is the perennial problem with alcohol advertising as well, like in other predatory industries, but particularly alcohol and gambling. You're a big loser if you think that this is a problem and you don't know how to have fun. So yeah, I think that the humour does play a role in there. But when you were talking about scrutiny of the advertisers as the missing piece here, well, this is a prime example. If Sportsbet. The ABC revealed that Sportsbet was buying, transaction data from NAB to better tailor their online advertising strategy. And when that was revealed by 7:30, NAB stopped selling the data to the secondary data provider. Great, okay, that's a good short-term outcome. But actually, if this happens all the time, this is hugely problematic. You shouldn't, these are serious harms, that people are being recruited. You might not, to a potentially addictive product, you might not be able to see the direct steps, but criticising the advertisers is the other way to target it. Okay, well, we know if these people do this, this is unacceptable, according to public standards. And if we know that gambling companies are prepared to exploit people at their most vulnerable, at their most miserable, their lowest self-esteem, and then latch onto that and continue relentlessly to pummel them with ads, we might think differently about the whole industry and cut against some of the more glossy way in which it presents itself. So I think focusing back on the advertisers is a really interesting idea, and one that's worth doing, because it's following the money. Okay, well, where are they spending it? Why? Do they obviously think it's impactful? Well, then let's figure out how that can be stopped, or whether we need a harm minimisation strategy against that.
for sure. Is there anyone else who wants to chime in on
This
that?
is a bit different from political advertising, but I think the trends are the same, so hopefully
Yeah,
it's
for
still a
sure.
useful discussion.
For sure.
I guess I could speak to the previous question with
Yeah.
so in advertising they talk about it as a funnel. There's this idea that you have brand advertising, which is you know, your big ads, you know, you think your Mad Men ads where you have the BMW with George Clooney or whatever, and people associate it with the brand, and then you come down the funnel and you go towards your what's called direct marketing, which is more like, you know, what we would traditionally think of as, you know, putting flies through mailboxes, more like what Kate was talking about in the previous panel. Less of that kind of what you could almost call like creative advertising, and more towards that kind of direct result. And then you can go, I guess, almost that one step further with digital to like the really awful stuff like retargeting and that really insidious stuff. But it's funny. It's this kind of chasing harm stuff it's interesting because it's almost like the mirror of what advertisers are doing, which is chasing benefit or return on investment. Where the golden ticket in advertising is to be able to prove that your ad was the one that got inside the consumer's head, got inside the black box, and made them make a particular purchase decision. There's a bit of a kind of a mythology in advertising that takes about 7 touch points to get a consumer to make a conversion or to make a purchase, to make a decision. So it'd be interesting to think about that, I think, a bit more.
For sure. I mean, we don't have time, so I'm about to go to questions, but like the whole affiliate marketing environment is another one we just don't have time. Like there's another panel just in that, right? And I guess that goes to the point of scam ads as well, right? The way that, like the real kind of bottom feeders in this environment and the ways and the tactics that they're using to essentially defraud people, right? And to use that ecosystem to do that. But yeah, are there questions for the panel? Kathy's has a microphone. Jam a hand up if you're interested in throwing one out. Yeah, up here. Thank you, brave soul, right? Asking the first question, right? It's always hard, right? A lot of pressure.
I'm just a bit curious on your take on, like, given a perfect situation, what would you want the dark ad situation to be? So, like the last panel, we discussed that, like, is it good to have a target personalized ad for like medical advice? Or like for you, even from like a legal perspective, what's like allowed at the moment? Like what would be like a perfect scenario for you?
Yeah, go, Simon. You sound like you've got
I was pretty taken by Amy's suggestion on the last panel that it's fine, but we don't need the dark, right? Like it's all about the transparency, and definitely advertising, targeted advertising in a digital space can be beneficial and used in a good way. But the problem is we can't even tell whether that is happening or not, because we can't understand, there's no way to properly understand the scope of the targeting and how it works.
Bill of Rights.
Yeah, like there's lots of things, right, to make it look perfect. I think it would require a lot of different changes. So you'd need like accountability or auditing, so you know that certain practices aren't happening, or so that certain data isn't being collected. Like that's one way to do it if you want transparency. I think there shouldn't be micro-targeting, basically. I don't think even medical advertising, even if it's supposedly bringing some benefit, is a good thing. I think people should go see their doctor, Like I think there's some utility in saying, well, there's only certain criteria you can use to advertise, and the rest of them you can't. And maybe there's you have to publish all those ads, and like more and more like broadcast media, it's got to be a single version, not multiple different versions for people based on different categorization. There are ways you could argue for that. I mean, I don't think the secondary data market, I mean, this is slightly different to what we're talking about in terms of platforms, but platforms do purchase secondary data, like Facebook does purchase secondary data, so it's not a totally remote issue. Like, I don't really think it serves a purpose, and in fact, it does the opposite. It incentivizes all sorts of companies, whether it's a pharmacy or some other loyalty scheme in a supermarket, to collect this information to then sell it off and monetize people's experiences. So I think it's generally just a bad industry that shouldn't be allowed, to be honest. I mean, I don't know if that's a commonly held view, but to my mind, there's a real opportunity to think whether it's serving a particular purpose, and maybe then advertising, if you think it's got a worthwhile purpose, needs to be done within the platform itself and not then informed by these data sets that are sold on for other purposes once they've been de-identified. So you can actually regulate for that and not permit people to sell data in that way relatively easily, I think, in regulatory terms. But that's quite a bold reform, and it's a $1 billion industry, don't get me wrong. But I think when you start tinkering at the edges, you realise the problem really is at the root of this kind of micro-targeting phenomenon that's been created in online environments, which just creates all sorts of ancillary problems that are really negative, that and incentivises all sorts of conduct that is pretty degrading for our public sphere, that it's hard to section off a part of it and say that shouldn't be permitted without looking at the whole, in my view.
Simon, do you want to come back to that? Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, I was just going to ask, one of the things that interests me about the secondary data market, which I think I broadly agree with you, I think that's part of a big part of where the problem is but it seems like a frighteningly difficult thing to regulate as a single jurisdiction. Like, isn't it sort of the kind of thing that needs a coalition of large countries to kind of make meaningful change?
Oh, I don't know, not necessarily. If you're broadcasting an ad and that's defined in a particular way, I don't know why you couldn't make a law that stops that. I mean, yeah, like obviously you could still purchase things, but you may not, that gives you insight. So this is why privacy is not just an individual right, it's a collective one. You know, even if you've never shared anything with Facebook, then they can make determinations about you based on certain demographic information and infer, right? So what other people have shared becomes then used against you, right? So it's a collective as well as individual right, in my view. And of course, that doesn't stop the secondary data market existing in other parts of the world, but I think you could actually prohibit micro-targeting within the geographical bounds of Australia, which would make secondary data much less valuable in a lot of ways.
But I mean, I could have my data collected by a company that doesn't operate within Australia, and I could have ads served to me by a company that doesn't operate within Australia, and how would an Australian jurisdiction stop that?
I mean, if it's on a platform, you'd regulate that platform. I mean, yeah, I mean, this is at present as well, what's considered a publication on a platform is in dispute. The High Court has said different things about different kinds of publications, whether it's comments on a page, whether it's an ad that's presented by Google. It's completely unclear what they'll say next, right? So this is an area of flux in legal terms. But I think if you're publishing an ad, let's say, without going too much into the legals, and you're a platform, there's an argument that you could prohibit what kind of information you rely on or what kind of micro-targeting might occur so that people see the same ad. I think that's possible, yeah. I mean, there's a few small hurdles to get through to get that regulation in place.
It's all right, we're all about blue sky here, right? Any small ones, or will we go to another question? No, we'll go to another question. Mark.
I was just going to say, I'm sure we're all of the same opinion broadly about what we want, but I was just going to comment on your comment about the personalized advertising. I mean, I'm old enough to remember, for example, American television in the 70s and 80s. And American television was exceptionally generic, and the reason it was generic was because advertisers would only fund shows that appealed to 16 to 39-year-olds. And so, you know, and of course, Netflix subscriptions and all those things have diversified the television content, but it's also because advertising could be targeted that allowed a much richer form of content to be created. And so, you know, so I'm not as, you know, so I think there are definite advantages to this personalized advertising world, you know, which aren't just about advertising, but actually about the content that this advertising is supporting.
I think that's such an interesting comment, because it's like, oh, well, I mean, I feel like the cart and the horse there, or the tail is wagging the dog. I'm not sure if we want a more creatively rich environment, if we want to make full use of the immense capacity of the internet to facilitate creative output, I think we probably ought to think about doing that in different ways than relying on an advertising model. Like, I don't particularly, I mean, I talked then about broadcast media. I don't particularly want to return to the days of broadsheets, you know, that fund journalism through classifieds, through other kinds of large page advertising. I think that's also a problem, right? I don't mean to be naive about the past, but I think if we think that the only way that creative content can be produced in in the online age is through advertising funding. I think that's strikes me as a bit unambitious. I think we should be able to get that creative content. There's all sorts of other impositions upon creators. I mean, we have a whole project on this at Digital Rights Watch, which is called Rebalancing the Internet Economy, if you're interested, where we look exactly at this. Like, how can creatives, people writing, people making music, people, community activists as well, how can they have an economy that works for them, that isn't dependent on advertising? And I think that the time is right for thinking about that. I'm sorry that's a bit off political advertising, but I think the things that we'll find out, or you guys will find out about political advertising, also have a larger implication for how advertising works generally. I mean, there'll be differences, but if this is what the only data set we can use, then let's find out as much as we can, see what we can infer about how it works outside of electoral settings as well.
Oh yeah, totally. And we do have other data, so it's not just the politics, which is good.
Can I speak to that?
Yeah, go for it, Sam.
I think it's a really good point, yeah, that whole chicken and the egg question, right, of diversified media and trying to cut up audiences and vice versa. It's an interesting one that with targeted advertising, because it almost cuts that that tie between audiences, because in theory, no matter where you're going, you should be getting the ads served to you based on your online behavioral advertising or whatever else they bought the data from. So it doesn't really matter if you're watching SBS on demand or if you're YouTube or Facebook or whatever, it's the data that's doing it. So in theory, I guess you could, and sorry, this is more like media scholar hat than ACAN, but it almost kind of doesn't reward the media as much, I don't think, because you're going to people on who they are less and not having to go for that different content to try to attract different audiences, if that makes sense. The second part to that as well is that one of the key draws of digital advertising is that it's sold to advertisers, to brands, etc. That's what I mean when I say advertisers, is that it's cheaper, that it's more efficient, as Nick was saying earlier in the day. The hackathon, less waste. The dream is to be able to only buy the right people, and when you read discussions in the industry about, say, television, broadcast advertising, it's still the golden goose because TV is incredibly effective, according to advertisers. But it's also, widespread. They refer to it as like a nuclear bomb. They always use weapon metaphors: nuclear bomb, shotgun, whatever you want to say. Wide spray. It's not a sniper rifle. Honestly, I've read these in the trade press, these terms. And so there's a lot of frustration with them because there's this mystification on the broadcast TV side because they can charge what they want because the advertisers are never quite sure what they're getting, and so they get those really high CPMs, cost per mil, cost per thousand impressions. Whereas digital advertising, they can get the higher CPMs, but they have to work a bit harder for it. So yeah, I'm not quite sure if that targeted ads necessarily deliver more money to the media.
Cool. I'm getting the wind up because we did kind of go a little bit over on the first panel, and then that pushed things a little bit back. So, always the kind of burden of being the last people to speak, right? But if I could press you just for and I will try and keep you to 30 seconds, but final little quips from everyone around anything, right? A reflection, a further provocation, something you want to see happen, wave a magic wand, this is what I want to see happen. Who wants to go first? Go, Simon.
I'll go first. I would like to re-emphasise Lizzie's point from her opening statement about privacy and the Privacy Act review that's going on at the moment being kind of a really important aspect of this and has the potential to kind of cut off the data flows that are causing some of the greatest harm. So I think pay attention to that.
I'd like to emphasise the previous points about scams. Yeah, look for scams because we hate scams. Australians lost $2 billion to scams last year. Mobile and telephones and texts are the highest. The second highest is social media. So anything you can do to find that would be a huge $2 billion prize to find.
Verity.
So I guess I would just say that in terms of political ads at least, what you're seeing is not the full picture, and that we also found in 2019 that there weren't as many ads as we expected, especially from people like Clive Palmer, but instead he was funding like meme mills instead, and like how we're going to collect that data. So it's just a small snippet, and it's making, in a way, certain data transparent when we have even less transparent data like memes that are circulating in private groups.
So for me, I would like to go back to the regulation bit where like Facebook did provide us like, more information about the political ads because of the regulations around like regarding the issues of elections. My guess is they have the information or this demographic information about other types of ad as well. So like if in ideal world, that should provide us like all these like details about every type of ads. But I guess like for this hackathon, like we can't really like rely on like social media platforms to provide us anything. So like for this hackathon, like it would be great for us to know like how to come up with better ideas or better methods on how to collect like a bigger picture or like a complete data set of advertisements in this space.
Yeah, I think that's a great point too. Like, what would you ask for next if they or not ask for? What would you demand next? Because we've demanded electoral information about ads during electoral periods. Well, let's work out what's the next thing that we can demand that platforms give us, because there's clearly lots of bad behaviour going on. There's clearly lots of behaviour that wouldn't pass the pub test, that people would feel upset about, that people would feel frustrated and manipulated. So that's a public sentiment we can work with. And what would be the next demand that you'd make of these platforms after you've had a look at what they've shown us, what they've been prepared to show us? Because I think it's been a bit reluctant, I have to say, because I think they think that it will be the thin end of the wedge. Well, my view is we should definitely get that wedge going and see what we can demand next from them.
And if I can indulge and just offer my own final thought, is that this point of the burden on those who've been harmed is something I keep coming back to. I know there's an audience member here tonight who has been a victim of identity theft, right? And there's possibly more now thanks to Optus. And why is the burden always on those that are harmed by these systems to try to have to deal with this themselves in the middle of what is an already very busy and a lot of other kind of pressures on daily life, having to deal with this as individuals rather than having competent governments, law enforcement, other agencies there with our backs helping us out in this particular moment. So I think a focus around removing the burden from those who are burdened by the harms of these systems. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for an amazing panel. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Sorry we did go a little bit over time.